From the year 1961 to 1994, the Soviet army occupied the summit of the Brocken, the highest mountain in northern Germany. During the next 28 years of the Cold War, the Soviet GRU, KGB and East German Stasi kept constant surveillance on Western Europe. The Brocken was for a time the most westerly military outpost of the Soviet Empire and a menacing feature visible from West Germany. This video is the story of the Soviet Spy Mountain. Hi there and welcome to another in my Cold War series of videos. So for today's adventure I've brought us out into central northern Germany, into the Harz Mountains, to a village called Torfhaus. Now I'll let you into a secret. I was here in 1982, about 40 years ago, and this place looked very different back then, because back then it was the front line between East and West, where NATO and the Warsaw Pact faced off directly against each other. Not with guns, but with antennas. This was the NATO listening post facing east, and over my right hand shoulder now, on the highest Harz Mountain, the Brocken, was the Soviet Warsaw Pact equivalent. In this video, I'm going to tell a story of the Soviet Spy Mountain, and also we're going to explore it. Something we couldn't do back then. Obviously, it was East Germany, but then even East Germans could not visit the Brocken because it was a Soviet closed military area. And that was only opened up after the Berlin Wall came down. Right, let's get underway. And this is where we are in Europe today, in the centre north of present-day Germany. Specifically, we're in the Harz Mountains National Park of Germany, in the village of Torfhaus on the B9 highway. And just over 3 miles to our east of Torfhaus is the highest mountain in the Harz range, the Brocken. The Brocken's importance during the Cold War began as a result of a geopolitical coincidence. You could even call it an accident, because in 1945, at the Yalta Conference during the last months of World War II, the Allied powers carved up Germany into occupation zones. The border between the Soviet and British occupation zone ran straight through the centre of the Harz Mountains, putting the village of Torfhaus 1.5 miles into what would later become West Germany, and the Brocken Mountain 1.5 miles inside East Germany. In 1961, the Cold War went absolutely ice cold, with a sudden closure of the inner German border and the forced division of Germany, leaving East and West facing off militarily against each other. The Soviets occupied the summit of the Brocken Mountain to be used as an electronic warfare station. Likewise, NATO built electronic warfare listening posts on the high ground and summits of the western Harz Mountains at Torfhaus and Württemberg. From the 1960s until the end of the Cold War, the Brocken was the Soviets' most westerly outpost. It sat menacingly in full view of the west, and aside from the fortifications of the inner German border, the Brocken station was one of the most visible landmarks of the Cold War. For us in the military during the Cold War of the 1980s, the Brocken station had an even more sinister reputation. It was our boogeyman, the Soviet Baba Yaga at the top of the mountain that watched our every move with a malign intent. Young army signallers were warned during their training that the Brocken listened to every single military radio transmission, looking for security breaches, poor procedures to try and identify tactics, units, commanders, etc. If you're an armoured vehicle commander on exercise, mess up on the radio and the Brocken will know. Press transmit while radio silence is imposed and you'll compromise the whole battle group and the Brocken will find us. So how much of that was true? Well, pretty much all of it. But we will never 100% know, because when the Soviets departed the Brocken in 1994, they took all their equipment and their secrets with them. What the Soviets got up to on the Brocken is still a state secret of the present-day Russian Federation. What we can assume, though, is that the Brocken station had electronic visibility for ground wave signals out to the curvature of the Earth horizon, about 150 miles, and then even further over the horizon out to about 300 miles. And this doesn't include air-to-ground and satellite communications, which would have been even further. So basically, the Brocken station meant the Soviets could see electronically the whole of the Western European theatre of operations. Right, let's go and visit the present-day Brocken Mountain. So it's now over 30 years since the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany. So today, if we want, we can simply walk from Torfhaus to the Brocken Mountain. But prior to the year 1990, that would not have been possible, because the inner German border would have been in the way between East Germany and West Germany. Do you wonder what that would look like? I can show you exactly what that would look like, because there's a remnant of the inner German border still intact. So that's what we'll do now. Let's take a wander up to the inner German border as if it was 1989 or before. Your first warning would be this West German border post, which says, "Halt hier Grenze." Stop, the border is here. This is the end of West Germany. If you ignore that side, then the next thing you would encounter is an East German border post painted black, red and yellow. Going beyond this meant that you had entered East Germany. After the DDR border column, and you've ignored that, you will next encounter the final denial fence of the border fortifications. Remember now, you are well inside East Germany and considered an intruder to the border guards, and therefore at risk of being arrested and put on trial in East Germany, or worse, being shot at. Yeah, of course, if this was pre-1989, the Cold War, the division of Germany, and this was the real inner German border, this would be a very, very foolhardy and dangerous thing to do. Would I have been shot for it after 1972, 73, 74? Probably not. You'd be shouted at through a tannoy from the tower. You'd be told to get back into West Germany. A squad of Grenztruppen would be dispatched across the western side of the fence, which, remember, is still in East Germany. They come and grab me and arrest me, and then you'd be put on trial in East Germany if you were caught. More often than not, though, you were treated as a nuisance, and the Bundesgrenzschutz, the West German Federal Border Service, were telephoned told to come and remove you, unless, of course, you were damaging the fence. What you did risk doing, though, is that this fence was mined and had a claymore type mine every 25 to 100 metres, depending on the level of threat. And you could set it off by pushing on the fence. If you were right next to the mine when it went off, yeah, it would kill you. But the shrapnel cone was aimed into the east, not into the west. So if you set it off and you were down range about 10, 20 metres, you probably wouldn't get any shrapnel. You just get deafened. Like I said, very dangerous thing to do. So nobody ever did unless they were mentally ill. Approaching from West Germany, the fence is as far as you would get in reality, but let's keep going for the sake of demonstration. On the other side of the fence, and approaching this BT6 watch gun tower, we are now crossing the death strip. Back in the day, this would have been sand, not grass. The death strip was called that because it was the free fire zone for the gun towers. Entering the death strip meant you would be shot. On the eastern side of the death strip is a concrete patrol track, and this ran the whole length of the inner German border. And it also links up all the watchtowers. A group of Grenztruppen will be tasked with a 4x4 to be a mobile patrol between all the towers. Now, what you found is that there would generally be 10 BT6 or BT9 towers. It's a BT6 behind me. And these will be linked by telephone and a patrol track to a BT 4x4 command post. That distance, probably about 25 to 30 kilometres on average, depending on the geographic layout. You would also find that sometimes you'd have groups of Grenztruppen dog handlers, and they would walk the patrol track with dogs to see if they could detect any humans hiding in the undergrowth, waiting to have a break for the fence line. So from the tower, I'm now walking back eastwards through the sterile zone along the tower access track. It's about 2 miles long. It's quite a tortuous walk, to be honest with you. Now, it's absolutely unthinkable to even consider doing this during the Cold War. You'd be shot. At the very least, if you had a humane group of Grenztruppen, they would arrest you. No East German ever would have done this. If you were going to have an attempt at the border, you would have done it under cover of darkness and certainly well away from the access track. At about 2 kilometres east of the final fence and death strip, I reached the edge of the security zone. So what we've got here is an example of the hinterland fence, and it's a gate into the sterile area. The hinterland fence was situated about a kilometre back from the main border final denial fence. For that reason, it wasn't as tall. It was about 1.5 metres. It was festooned with barbed wire, sometimes razor wire, and it was really a demarcation and a deterrent as opposed to a physical obstacle. You could climb it quite easily and you'd probably get away with it. However, as an East German, you couldn't approach within 4 kilometres of the border. But people did live in that zone and they needed a permit to do so. And if you wanted to visit a friend who lived in that zone, you also needed a permit. What you couldn't do, though, is cross the hinterland fence and approach the border. If you were seen, you're almost certainly going to be arrested and imprisoned for it. At night, you'd probably be shot at. From the hinterland fence, 4 kilometres eastwards was the border restricted zone. East German citizens required a state permit to live, work or visit this zone. But not the Brocken. That wasn't included, which was completely off limits to East German citizens, even those with a border zone permit. So very obviously, walking up the Brocken from West Germany during the Cold War during the 1980s was not an option. And in the present day, it's far too much like hard work for me. So I'm going to take the easy option. I'm going to drive out to the village of Schierke and take a train to the summit. But even that would not be possible during the Cold War. I'm presently on the Braunlage to Elend Road. Let me show you on the map what the problem was. To get to the village of Schierke, I'm driving east from the town of Braunlage towards the village of Elend. In 2023, this takes about 20 minutes. But prior to German reunification, this road was closed at the border, sealed off, and it looked like this. There was no border crossing here. Simply, in 1961, the East German authorities closed the road. They laid the inner German border fence across it, dug an anti-tank ditch and protected the fence with anti-tank dragon's teeth. The tarmac was also ripped up to the West German border. And that's where it remained for the next 30 years. During the Cold War, the nearest official border crossings were 40 kilometres to the north or 40 kilometres to the south. Thankfully today, since reunification, the road has been modernised and widened. It's quite a pleasure to drive. And when you come across the former border, you'll find this commemorative road sign that you find everywhere in Germany where a road crosses the former inner German border. It says in German, "Here was Germany and Europe partitioned until the 12th of November 1989, around 14:30 hours. A further 10 minutes drive brings us to our destination, and it's the furthest you can drive a vehicle up the Brocken, the mountain village of Schierke. Now today it's very touristy and it's a holiday destination and is very popular. But during the Cold War, this was a garrison town for the border troops, and it also housed Stasi and Soviet troops who worked on the Brocken Mountain. It was the furthest normal East German citizens could go up the mountain. About a mile outside of the village centre is Schierke Bahnhof, or the station. And this is where we're going to swap our car for a train to take us the rest of the way up to the Brocken summit. The Harz Mountains still has its own unique railway system, the Harz Narrow Gauge Railway, which is now over 125 years old, with a Brockenbahn line running all the way to the summit of the Brocken Mountain, with Schierke the penultimate station. Something you'll find surprising is that most of the trains that run on the Harz Railway are mid-1900s era steam trains. We can thank communism for the preservation of this unique part of German heritage. Because under communism in East Germany, everything was state-owned, including all the railways. But East Germany was cash-strapped for most of its existence. So worked on the principle of if something isn't broke, don't spend money trying to fix it. So the steam trains survived right up until German reunification. Whereas Western European countries scrapped most of their steam locomotives in the late 1960s and invested in their railways. Today, the Harz Mountain Railway is a heritage railway and is preserved as such. I'm not really much of a train enthusiast, to be honest with you, but the Brockenbahn is a unique experience, the sights and the smells of the steam locomotive, and watching it kick out enough black smoke to ruin Greta Thunberg's entire childhood was a sight to behold. A word to the wise though, be warned, the return ticket for an adult from Schierke to the Brocken summit and back again is an eye-watering €55. During the Cold War 1961 to 1990, this passenger service didn't run up the Brocken, and it was rare for the train to go up the mountain at all, and if it did, it was simply to deliver freight to the military establishment on the summit. The journey from Schierke to the Brocken summit takes about 20 minutes, which is enough time now, I think, for me to tell you the history of the Brocken summit. Going back several centuries, and during medieval times, the Brocken was associated with witchcraft and the occult, and this folklore was cemented into literature in Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's 1808 play Faust, where the witches of the Brocken dance on the summit during Walpurgis night. And to this day, the Brocken is still synonymous with witches, just maybe not these four. Construction on the summit of the Brocken started around 1800 with the construction of a mountain lodge, but within a couple of decades this burnt down, to be replaced by a purpose-built stone construction Brocken Hotel. But it was the arrival of the Brockenbahn, the narrow gauge railway, in 1899 that brought the big numbers of tourists and day trippers to the summit of the Brocken. It was the National Socialist years of the 1930s that saw most major infrastructure projects on the summit of the Brocken, including the first long-range TV transmitter tower in Germany, built specifically to broadcast the 1936 Berlin Olympics. It was also National Socialism that brought about the more or less complete destruction of the Brocken summit. During World War II, the Brocken summit was taken over for military use, and because of that, in April 1945, it was heavily bombed by the US Air Force, destroying much of the infrastructure. At the end of World War II, the Brocken fell under the control of the Soviet occupation forces, but at this time they had little use for it. So between 1946 and 1961, East Germans could still visit the summit of the Brocken, and the East German government refurbished the TV transmitter for broadcasting across East Germany. After 20 minutes of chugging up the mountain by steam train, we finally arrived at the Brocken station, which was rebuilt in the 1950s from the bombed out ruins left after World War II. And this is how the station would more or less have looked during the period 1961 to 1990 when it was a Soviet military base. Because in 1961, everything changed on the summit of the Brocken. After the dramatic closure of the inner German border in 1961, the Soviets reoccupied the summit of the Brocken, this time with the assistance and the accompaniment of the communist East German government. Immediately a 2-kilometre exclusion zone was implemented around the mountain to keep ordinary East Germans away, under pain of imprisonment. During the next 28 years, the Brocken summit was transformed into a high-tech electronic surveillance station, not only for the Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, and also the KGB, but also for the East German secret state police, commonly known as the Stasi. Now, obviously, this was a highly classified installation during the Cold War, so there's little photographic evidence of what was up here. But I can use this photo from around 1989 to explain the layout of the station during the last years of the Cold War. Firstly, we'll look at the defence of the site. Now, I've already mentioned that there was a 2-kilometre exclusion zone around the mountain, but the actual summit was heavily defended and was provided with a company of the East German Army to do so. The East Germans had responsibility for the outer security of the site. The summit itself was walled in with the exact same design as the Berlin Wall, and it was also equipped with 2 BT-6 observation and gun towers. There were 3 access gates to the summit station, 2 vehicle access and 1 rail access, and these gates were protected jointly by East German Army and Soviet soldiers, the gates themselves being 2.5 metre high, well-meshed steel gates. The Soviets had primacy inside the wall, and the site itself was commanded by a Soviet colonel. While there was cooperation in protecting the site and its administration, once you're inside the site itself, the surveillance operation was entirely separated by nationality. The Soviets conducted their own operations and the Stasi conducted theirs, and there was absolutely no cooperation or intelligence sharing on the site. The Soviets could not enter the East Germans' installations, and vice versa, the East Germans could not enter the Soviets. Of course, this is all open source now, but during the Cold War, Western intelligence gave these two separate operations separate code names. The Soviet GRU KGB operation was known as Object Yenisei, and the Stasi operation was known as Object Urian. So let's take a look at those. The Soviet installation, Object Yenisei, took up about half the Brocken site, and it was a secure compound within a secure compound and protected by Soviet soldiers. The installation consisted of various radomes and rectangular antenna sheds, operations buildings and accommodation. As mentioned earlier, we will probably never fully know what the Soviets got up to with Object Yenisei, and even though the USSR collapsed in 1991, the present-day Russian Federation classes it as a state secret. Though it is understood that Yenisei was a signals intelligence and electronic warfare station targeting NATO forces in Western Europe, particularly NATO's Army Group North and Army Group Centre. And it's also likely that the KGB ran specialist espionage operations from Yenisei. The East German operation was much smaller than the Soviet one, codenamed Object Urian and marked here in yellow. Now, unlike the Soviet operation, we know exactly what the East Germans did, because Object Urian is now a matter of German public record after the reunification of Germany. Urian was run by the secret state police, the Stasi, and was more concerned about intercepting telephone calls of its own citizens and West German citizens, intelligence gathering on West German persons of interest, and any plots or perceived threats against the East German state. Finally, there were also civilians working on the summit of the Brocken, meteorologists working in the state weather station, and also TV transmitter staff to service the East German state TV transmitter. Now, point of note, the new TV transmitter mast was constructed in 1973, principally to replace the old one built in 1956. However, these were not purely civilian use towers. In fact, it's believed the main motivation for building the 1973 tower was to provide higher elevation and additional antenna space for the intelligence operations for both the Soviets and for the Stasi. Okay, that was how the Brocken looked during the Cold War, up until 1989. So how does it look today? Well, as you would expect, very different, and let me explain why. Before I show you around the present-day summit, it's important to remember that everything changed on the 3rd of December 1989, which saw the German people reclaim the summit from the Soviets and the Stasi. And this sign commemorates that day. And it says in German, "Here, as part of the peaceful revolution in the GDR on the 3rd of December 1989, around 2:45 p.m, the wall of the military restricted area of the Brocken was forced open." Let me tell you that story. Where we stood now is the main road access from the valleys and villages up to the summit of the Brocken. And prior to 1990, this would have been the main security gates into the Brocken Summit Secure Compound. It is also the scene of some quite momentous events on the 3rd of December 1989. A month earlier, the Berlin Wall had collapsed and the inner German border opened, with the East German government in disarray. But the Brocken military security zone remained in place until that morning. A group of 150 to 200 villagers from all around the Harz Mountain villages met up in the village of Schierke, about 2 kilometres further south down the valley from here, and then they walked up this path and arrived at this gate about 12:45 in the afternoon. They were met by the commanding officer of the Soviet garrison. Now, he knew they were coming, and instead of deploying troops with guns to protect the site, he brought tea and entered a negotiation. When it was quite clear that the protesters were not going to back down, the security gates were opened and the protesters were allowed into the compound. And from that point on, the Brocken summit was reclaimed for the German people. Now, obviously, all the secure buildings were locked up and people wandering around the compound couldn't do a lot. But the Soviets knew the number was up. But it then took a further 4 years for the last Soviet soldier to leave the Brocken. Behind me now is a memorial garden to the events of the 3rd of December 1989. This memorial stone says, "The Brocken, free again. Walled in for 28 years until the 3rd of December 1989. It's dedicated by the Hearts Club. And 34 years after the peaceful storming of the Brocken Summit in 1989, this is how the summit looks today in 2023. Very different from the Cold War fortress that I showed you earlier. So let's take a look around and see what's up here today. The most obvious change is that the security wall, the towers and the defences have now completely gone. They've been removed in the early 1990s. And where the wall used to be is now a footpath that circumnavigates the Brocken Summit. The other biggest change on the Brocken Summit is that Object Yenisei, the Soviet installation, has completely gone. The Soviets agreed to leave a reunified Germany in 1991, but it still took them until 1994 to depart the Brocken, taking every trace of their operation with them. Well, not quite every trace, because they still left concrete foundations for the German people to clean up. The 1973 TV mast is still extant and is now completely civilianised, used to broadcast German TV, radio and for telecommunications use. You'll notice the antenna on the roof of the old TV transmitter has now gone and is replaced by a radome which houses a German civilian air traffic control radar. Probably only if you're a Cold War historical nerd like me would you recognise that this is the typical cast concrete roadway used on military roads in East Germany. And it's still up here on the Brocken. They didn't see any need to rip it up. Closer in now to the central buildings on the Brocken and panning to the left, we can see the old TV transmitter tower with its air traffic control radar radome on the top, which is now the Brocken Hotel, and we'll look at that in a minute. And to the left of that, Object Urian, the Stasi Mosque. Today this building is called the Brocken House and it contains a museum and national park information centre. But this is the original surveillance building of the East German Stasi Object Urian. It was built in 1985 and nicknamed by Western intelligence at the time the Stasi Mosque due to its resemblance to a Middle Eastern Islamic mosque. Unlike the Soviets were able to, after German reunification, the Stasi could not hide their infrastructure or their activities, which after state investigation are now a matter of German public record. Thankfully for that, for historical reasons, the Stasi Mosque has been preserved. From 1985 to 1989, originally this building had 3 operations floors, and then on the roof an equipment radome. The mosque also took antenna feeds from both TV masts and antennas situated around the site. The Brocken House Museum is quite small and it costs about €11 to enter. The first floor is all natural history, but the second floor is all dedicated to the Soviet Stasi years on the Brocken. That is quite interesting. A real bonus of the museum is from the 3rd floor you can climb up onto the roof of the Stasi Mosque and visit the original equipment radome. Inside there is a display of electronic surveillance equipment and the capabilities of the Stasi, including some recorded telephone calls, although the inside of the radome is not historically accurate as it would have been during the operational years. Stepping outside the radome onto the roof of the Stasi Mosque on a clear day, which isn't that usual on the Brocken, you'll see why Object Yenisei and Object Urian were so important to the Warsaw Pact. This panorama, and as far as your eye can see, is what would have been West Germany during the Cold War years. The view is a clear visual reminder of the reach of the Brocken, remembering that electronic surveillance can go much, much further than the human eye, and why the Brocken was so protected during the Cold War years. After a long day of exploring the Harz Mountains, I took advantage of another major change in the 30 years since the Brocken was a military fortress. The old TV transmitter tower, used by the East Germans as part of Object Urian after the new tower was built in 1973, today has been completely renovated and is now the Brocken Hotel. The Brocken Hotel costs around €100 a night to stay, and there is no online booking. You have to email or phone the hotel directly to book. I'll put a link in the description in case you want to follow my footsteps. The rooms are quite basic, but you're at the top of a mountain. What really do you expect? Luxury? There is a restaurant up here that does evening meals and breakfast, and that was quite okay. I have to say that I found it quite eerie to spend a night on the Brocken Mountain, possibly for historical reasons, but also because after the last train departs for Schierke at 5 p.m, all the tourists are gone and there's hardly anybody left up here. A real advantage of all the tourists going home at 5 p.m. is that you get the Brocken Hotel's observation deck at the top of the tower all to yourself to watch the sun go down over Western Europe from 1100 metres. Alternatively, if the weather's good, which is admittedly unusual on the Brocken, and it was good when I visited, you can walk out to the legendary Witch's Altar, which was mentioned in Goethe's play Faust. Sadly though, there were no witches when I visited the Brocken. You'll recall I started this video off in the village of Torfhaus, which prior to German reunification would have been in West Germany. And here I'm now stood at the summit stone of the Brocken, which prior to 1994 actually, would have been the Soviet listening post. The summit stone is actually placed on an old Soviet radome installation. Interesting to think now that this would have been inconceivable 35 years ago, and this was the most westerly Soviet posting in East Germany. What better place to finish our long historical tour of the Brocken Mountain than the roof of the Stasi Mosque, the Stasi's surveillance building. Thank you for watching this video, and if you found it interesting, please consider clicking like. If you enjoy Cold War content or modern historical content, please check out the rest of my channel and consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you later. Bye.